My guest is Professor Steve Jones, a geneticist. His book deals with that touchy subject of religion and science.
My name is Steve Jones. This is my book, The Serpent's Promise, the Bible Retold as Science. This is an attempt to rewrite the Bible as if it were a scientific textbook, which in fact in many ways it was. It was an attempt thousands of years ago to understand the world around us and to give an explanation of the physics, chemistry and biology that we see every day. And so the questions it asks were very sensible ones. Some of the answers were perhaps a little less so, but we're still asking the same questions and the answers are better.
Isn't it the case though that as a scientist, your job essentially is to tell people who believe things like the world is 6,000 years old or that woman was made from a rib, that they are basically talking nonsense?
Well, they are basically talking nonsense, but what I find is however much you tell them, they refuse to listen to you. So I think a scientist's job isn't to insist that he or she is right and their opponents are wrong. The scientist's job is to find out what's going on, and sometimes, quite often, the scientists themselves will turn out to be wrong and will have to change their minds, often in a rather embittered way. But that's the essential difference between a scientific explanation and a faith-based religious explanation, because a religious explanation doesn't need evidence. So it doesn't matter what the evidence is, it won't change. A science-based explanation is not an explanation without evidence, and if the evidence changes, the explanation changes too.
Do you believe that religion and science are antithetical?
In all frankness, I do think that religion and science are in many ways antithetical. I know there's endless argument about this, particularly by the many scientists who are religious. But the problem is that religion is something that depends on faith. And once a scientist starts depending on faith, he or she is finished as a scientist. But I have to say, it's rather difficult to avoid incest in this modern world. I'd like, if you don't mind, to introduce each of you to your sixth cousin. Could you shake the hand of the person to your left? And those of you of European ancestry are, roughly speaking, sixth cousins to each other, even if you don't know it. And even if most of your ancestry comes from elsewhere in the world, you're probably seventh or eighth cousins. We're much, much more closely related to each other than we think, most people think, and as a result, most marriages, most matings are between relatives. In other words, they're to some degree incestuous. Okay, so why do I think that we're all so closely related? It's a matter of simple arithmetic, actually. Here we have a picture of the apocalypse, okay? The end of time, and let's remind ourselves what happens. This is the Blake drawing of the apocalypse. And let's remind ourselves what that is. That's when, at the end of time, on the Day of Judgment, all the people on earth who have ever lived will rise from their graves and gather together on the plain of Armageddon, where they'll be separated into the righteous, go to heaven, and the unrighteous, that's us lot probably, who will burn in hell forever and ever. Well, that's a nice little story. It actually has a real historic background. This is a picture of a place I've been to, actually. It's the city of Megiddo in northern Israel, which is the biblical Armageddon. And the Armageddon story began with the destruction of that city by the Assyrian king Sargon in 722 BC. And what happened was the people of the city were attacked, most of them were killed, and they were driven out into the wilderness. And that was actually the origin of the idea of the 7 lost tribes of Israel, you may have heard of. And they generated among themselves the feeling that sometime in the future their descendants would return to that city at the end of time, and then they would be back in the homeland where they felt that they belonged. Well, it's a very powerful legend, and you can actually do some sums on it. If that happened in 722 BC, we've all got, of course, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents and the like. We could multiply up how many people might be gathered at the time of Armageddon, which roughly speaking is 47 human generations ago, 47 to 50, and it's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, and go on like this for hours. If you do that 47 times, you come to 10 with something like, I can't remember the number, 10 with something like 60 or so zeros after it. And that would represent, of course, a ball of humans as big as the Earth expanding at the speed of light. And that clearly is not what's going to happen. Why is that? It is because, of course, we don't have that number of ancestors. We may have 2 parents, we may have 4 grandparents, we may have 8 great-grandparents, we probably haven't got 16 great-great-grandparents, and the further back you go, the more and more ancestors we share, because there simply weren't enough people around to allow us each to have our own independent family line.
Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, whose work we heavily promote and recommend here on this channel. His testable predictions and his research program, his active research program in discovering the history of humanity through genetic signatures and DNA stamps and so on and so forth. George was covering that in the sense that these mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome phylogenetic trees, these family trees, we know that there's extremely low variation in the mitochondrial DNA and in the Y chromosome. Y chromosome obviously inherited on the father's side. The male side, mitochondrial DNA, we inherit from our mothers. And there's only a few DNA differences separating any 2 people in both uniparentally DNA compartments, uniparentally inherited DNA compartments, I should say. And as George was showing, when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA, we have what's called the 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N. So all mitochondrial DNA diversity worldwide, these DNA differences go right back, bam, to these 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N, which Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson is suggesting may be the 3 wives of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if that really is the case, that means the history of civilization in both of these DNA compartments only go back what? Well, as George pointed out, 4,500 years. That means the history of civilization, the history of humanity should be detectable in these non-recombining DNA compartments. So this was a prediction that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has made years ago, originally in his book Replacing Darwin, and even before that he would talk about it.
And what's the gold standard in science again?
Making testable and falsifiable predictions. So young Earth creationists are meeting the gold standard of science. Now here's the thing, guys. This data here, these predictions have gone dodged and ignored by even the most militant of critics. Poor dodgeball Dan Stern Cardinal, he's probably been having nightmares over these confirmed predictions. All the critics, personally, all the debates that I've done, they've got their rescue devices, they've got their assumption-based methods, and I always say, well, why are Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's predictions, why are they working so well? Well, his new book is available for pre-order, Human DNA's Big Surprise. The data in this book is going to be a huge game changer. The critics are not going to be able to deal with it. And that includes these Bible compromisers like Joshua Stramidas and William Lane Craig, who have their own books out that will be no match to the fulfilled predictions here. So it's groundbreaking scientific research that rewrites everything you thought you knew about race, ethnicity, and even human history. Notice that, human history. And it's only possible because the researcher, Harvard-trained Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, starts with the history and the timeline God has given us in his word. And as George was talking about the history of civilization, I mean, the Egyptians, the Persians, Genghis Khan's empire, right, George? The Romans, the Mayans. Recent genetic discoveries are uncovering surprising links between us and the peoples of old, links that rewrite race, ethnicity, and human history. And remember, these discoveries are based on the assumption that the history of humanity and the history of the universe is accurately recorded in the book of Genesis. So from this starting point, we've made retrodictions and predictions, and the results are fascinating. It destroys the old earth paradigm. It destroys the universal common ancestry paradigm. This part here, the Rosetta Stone of human history, notice this, has been discovered. So these critics, like your dodgeball Dan Stern Cardinal or these militant theistic evolutionists, they'll say, yeah, predictions are being made, but they're not being tested or confirmed. And it's like over and over again, George, how many times have you seen in live debate where I said, as a matter of fact, yes, they are working so well, and why? Why? And they never have a response. So apparently there's a conspiracy, or young earth creation scientists are just making this up. But no, the Rosetta Stone of human history has been discovered, and it confirms the history starting in God's word and makes stunning discoveries about who we are, where we came from, and what happened to our ancestors. Just know 2022 is it's a great time to be a young earth creationist, and we've got the critics cornered. They don't know what to do. They are not meeting the gold standard of science, and it's not looking too well for them.